Morning, everybody. So yesterday in chapter 17, Brian started his way towards getting into the airplane, and one thing that they've been slightly hinting at is he's getting close to feeling the signs of winter. So as you remember, he was going to his dad's house for the summer, and it's been, I think, around 45 to 50 days. So he's definitely spent the entire summer, especially when you consider it's in Canada. So he's brushing up against the first signs of winter. So let's see what happens in chapter 18. Brian worked around the tail of the plane 2 more times, pulling himself along the stabilizer and the elevator, but there simply wasn't a way in. Stupid, he thought. I was stupid to think I could just come out here and get inside the plane. Nothing is that easy. Not out here. Not in this place. Nothing is easy. He slammed his fist against the body of the plane, and to his complete surprise, the aluminum cover gave easily under his blow. He hit it again, and once more it bent and gave, and he found that even when he didn't strike it, but just a little, it pushed, and it still moved. It was really, he thought, very thin aluminum skin over a kind of skeleton that gave it, and if it gave easy, he might be able to force his way through. The hatchet. He might be able to cut or hack with the hatchet. He reached to his belt and pulled the hatchet out, picked a place where the aluminum gave to his push, and took an experimental swing at it. The hatchet cut through the aluminum as if it were soft cheese. He couldn't believe it. 3 more hacks, and he had a triangular hole the size of his hand, and he could see 4 cables that he guessed were the control cables going back to the tail. And he hit the skin of the plane with the frenzied series of hacks to make it still larger opening, and he was bending a piece of aluminum away from 2 aluminum brackets of some kind when he dropped the hatchet. It went straight down past his legs. He felt it bump his foot and then go down into the water. And for a second, he couldn't understand that he had done it. For all this time, all the living and fighting, the hatchet had been everything. He had always worn it. Without the hatchet, he had nothing. No fire, no tools, no weapons. He was nothing. The hatchet had been him. And he had dropped it. Ugh, he yelled, choked on it, a snarl cry of rage at his own carelessness. The hole in the plane was still too small for him to use it for anything, and now he didn't have a tool. That was the kind of thing I would have done before, he said to the lake, to the skies, to the trees. When I came here, I would have done that. Not now. Not now. Yet he had, and he hung on to the raft for a moment and felt sorry for himself, for his own stupidity. But as before, the self-pity didn't help, and he knew he only had one course of action. He had to get the hatchet back. He had to dive and get it back. But how deep was it? In the deep end of the gym pool at the school, he had no trouble getting to the bottom. And that was, he was pretty sure, about 11 feet. Here it was impossible to know the exact depth. The front end of the plane, anchored by the weight of the engine, was obviously on the bottom. But it came back up at an angle, so the water wasn't as deep as the plane was long. He pulled himself out of the water so his chest would expand, took 2 deep breaths, and swiveled and dove, pulling his arms and kicking at the bottom of the raft with his feet. His first thrust took him down a good 8 feet, but the visibility was only 5 feet beyond that, and he could not see bottom yet. He clawed down 6 or 7 feet, the pressure pushing in his ears until he held his nose and popped them and just ran out of breath, and headed back up, he thought he saw the bottom, still 4 feet below his dive. He exploded out of the surface, bumping his head on the side of the elevator when he came up, and took air like a whale, pushing the stale air out until he wheezed, taking new in. He would have to get deeper yet and still have time to search while he was down there. Stupid, he thought once more, cursing himself. Just dumb. He pulled air again and again, pushing his chest out until he could not possibly get any more capacity, then took one more deep lungful, wheeled, and dove again. This time he made an arrow out of his arms and used his legs to push off the bottom of the raft, all he had in his legs, to spring, snap, and propel him down. As soon as he felt himself slowing a bit, he started raking back with his arms at his sides like paddles, and thrusting with his legs like a frog, and this time he was so successful that he ran his face into the bottom of the mud. He shook his head to clear his eyes and looked around. The plane disappeared out and down in front of him. He thought he could see the windows that made him think again of the pilot sitting inside, but he forced his thoughts from it. He could see no Hatchet. Bad air triggers were starting to go off in his brain, and he knew he was limited to seconds now. But if he held for a moment and tried moving a bit, he just ran out of air. Knew that he was going to have to blow soon. He saw the handle sticking out of the mud. He made one grab, missed, reached again, and felt his fingers close on the rubber. He clutched it and in one motion slammed his feet down into the mud and powered himself up. But now his lungs were ready to explode, and he had flashes of color in his brain, explosions of color, and he would have to take a pull of water, take it into his lungs, and just as he opened his mouth to take it in, to pull all the water in the lake in his head, blew out of the surface and into the light. Shack! It was as if a balloon had exploded. Old air out of his nose and mouth, and he pulled new in again and again. He reached for the side of the raft and hung there, just breathing, until he could think once more. The hatchet, clutched and shining in his right hand. All right, the plane. Still the plane. He went back to the hole in the fuselage and began to chop and cut again, peeling the aluminum skin off in pieces. It was slow going because he was careful, very careful with the hatchet. But he hacked and pulled until he had opened a hole large enough to pull his head and shoulders in and look down into the water. It was very dark inside the fuselage, and he could see nothing. Certainly no sign of the survival pack. There were some small pieces and bits of paper floating on the surface inside the plane. Dirt from the floor of the plane that had floated up, but nothing substantial. Well, he thought, did you expect it to be easy? So easy that way? Just open her up and get the pack? Right. He would have to open it more, much more, so he could poke down inside and see what he could find. The survival pack had been in a zippered nylon bag, or perhaps canvas of some kind, and he thought it had been red, or was it gray? Well, it didn't matter. It must have been moved when the plane crashed, and it might be jammed down under something. He started chopping again, cutting the aluminum away in small triangles, putting each one on the raft as he chopped. He could never throw anything away again, he thought, because they might be useful later. Bits of metal, fish arrowheads or lure maybe. And when he finally finished again, he had cleared away a whole side of the top of the fuselage and stuck out of the water. Had cut down into the water as far as he could reach and had a hole almost as big as he was, except that it was crossed and crisscrossed with aluminum, or it might be steel. He couldn't tell. The braces and formers and cables, it was an awful tangled mess. But after chopping some braces, there was room for him to wiggle through and get inside. He had held back for a moment, uncomfortable with the thought of getting inside the plane. What if the tail settled back to the bottom and he got caught and couldn't get out? It was a horrible thought, but then he reconsidered. The thing had been up now for 2 days. Plus a bit, and he had been hammering and climbing on it, and it hadn't gone back down. It seemed pretty solid. He eeled in through the cables in the formers, wiggling and pulling until he was inside the tail with his head clear of the surface of the water and his legs down in the angled floor. When he was ready, he took a deep breath and pushed down along the floor with his legs, feeling for some kind of fabric or cloth, anything, with his bare feet. He touched nothing but the plane's floor. Mosquito. Up for a new breath. Then he reached down the formers underwater and pulled himself beneath the water, his legs pushing down and almost to the backs of the front seats. And finally, on the left side of the plane, he thought he felt something. His foot hit something, cloth or canvas. Up for more air, deep breathing. Then one more grab at the formers, and pushing as hard as he could, he jammed his feet down and he hit again. Definitely canvas or heavy nylon. And at this time, he pushed his foot. He thought he felt something inside of it. Something hard. It had to be the bag, driven forward by the crash. It was jammed into the backs of the seats and caught on something. He tried to reach for it and pull it, but didn't have air left and went up for more. Lungs filled in great gulps. He shot down again, pulling on the formers until he was almost there. Then wheeling down head first, he grabbed at the cloth. It was the survival bag. He pulled and tore at it to loosen it, and just as it broke free, his heart leapt to feel it rise as he looked up, above the bag. In the light coming through the side window, the pale green light from the water, he saw the pilot's head was only wasn't the pilot's head any longer. The fish. He'd never really thought of it, but the fish. The fish had been eating it all this time. They had been at the pilot all this time, almost 2 months, nibbling and chewing, and all that remained was not quite clean skull, and when he looked up it wobbled loosely. Too much. Too much. His mind screamed in horror, and he slammed back and was sick in the water. Sick, so he choked on it and tried to breathe water and could have ended there. Ended with the pilot where it almost ended when they first arrived, except his legs jerked. It was instinctive. Fear more than anything else. Fear of what he had seen. They had jerked and pushed, and he was headed up when they jerked and he shot to the surface. Still inside the birdcage of formers and cables. His head slammed into a bracket as he cleared, and he reached up to grab it, and he was free, in the air, hanging in the tail. He hung that way for several minutes, choking and heaving and grasping for air, fighting to clear the picture of the pilot from his mind. It went slowly. He knew it would never completely leave, but he looked to the shore, and there were trees and birds. The sun was getting low and the golden over his shelter, and when he stopped coughing, he could hear the gentle sounds of evening, the peaceful sounds, the bird sounds and the breeze in the trees. The peace finally came to him, and he settled his breathing. He was still a long way from being finished. He had a lot of work to do. The bag was floating next to him, but he had to get it out of the plane and onto the raft, then back to the shore. He wiggled out through the formers. It seemed harder than when he came in, and pulled the raft around. The bag fought him. It was almost as if it didn't want to leave the plane. He pulled and jerked, and still it wouldn't fit, and at last he had to change the shape of it, rearranging what was inside by pushing and pulling at the sides until he had narrowed it and made it longer. Even when it finally came, it was difficult, and he had to pull first at one side, then another, an inch at a time, squeezing it through. All of this took some time, and when he finally got the bag out and tied on top of the raft, it was nearly dark. He was bone-tired from working in the water all day, chilled deep, and he still had to push the raft ashore. Many times he thought he would not make it. With the added weight of the bag, which seemed to get heavier by the foot, coupled with the fact that he was getting weaker all the time, the raft seemed barely to move. He kicked and pulled and pushed, taking the shortest way straight back to the shore, hanging to rest many times, then surging again and again. It seemed to take forever, and when at last his feet hit bottom and he could push against the mud and slide the raft to the shore weeds to bump against the bank, he was so weak he couldn't stand, had to crawl. So tired he didn't even notice the mosquitoes that tore at him like a gray, angry cloud. He had done it. That's all he could think now. He had done it. He turned and sat on the banks with his legs in the water and pulled the bag ashore and began the long drag. He couldn't lift it back down to the shore to the shelter. 2 hours, almost 3, he dragged and stumbled in the dark, brushing the mosquitoes away, something on his feet, more often than his knees, finally to drop across the bag and to sleep when he made the sand in front of the doorway. He had done it. I'm counting pages. We're doing this. We're going right on. Chapter 19. Treasure. Unbelievable riches. He could not believe the contents of the survival pack. The night before, he was so numb with exhaustion, he couldn't do anything but sleep. All day in the water had tired him so much that, in the end, he had fallen asleep sitting against the shelter wall. Oblivious even to the mosquitoes, to the night, to anything. But with the false gray dawn, he had awakened instantly and began to dig in the pack to find amazing, wonderful things. There was a sleeping bag, which he hung to dry over his shelter roof on the outside, a foam sleeping pad, an aluminum cook set with 4 little pots and 2 frying pans, and he actually even had a fork and a knife and a spoon. A waterproof container with matches and 2 small butane lighters, a sheath knife with a compass in the handle, as if a compass would help him, he thought, smiling. A first aid kit with bandages and tubes of antiseptic paste and small scissors, a cap that says Cessna across the front in large letters. Why a cap, he wondered. It was adjustable and he put it on immediately. A fishing kit with 4 coils of line, a dozen small lures and hooks and sinkers. Incredible wealth. It was like all the holidays in the world. All the birthdays were here. He sat in the sun by the doorway where he had dropped the night before and pulled the presents as he thought of them, one at a time, to examine them, turn them in the light, touch them, and feel them with his hands and eyes. Something that had first puzzled him. He pulled out what seemed to be a broken off, bulky stock of a rifle, and he was going to put it aside, thinking it might be for something else in the pack. When he shook it, it rattled. After working at it a moment, he found the butt of the stock came off. Inside there was a barrel and a magazine and action assembly, with a clip and a box full of 50 shells. It was a .22 survival rifle. He had seen one once in the sporting goods store where he went for bike parts, and the barrel screwed onto the stock. He had never owned a rifle, never fired one, but had seen them on television, of course. And after a few moments, he figured out how to put it together by screwing the action onto the stock, how to load it, and how to put the clip full of bullets in the action. Okay, it's not a clip, it's a magazine, but we're just going to let that slide. It was a strange feeling holding the rifle. It somehow removed him from everything around him. Without the rifle, he had to fit in, to be part of it all, to understand it and use it, the woods, all of it. With the rifle, suddenly he didn't have to know. He didn't have to be afraid or understand. He didn't have to get close to a full bird to kill it. He didn't have to know how it would stand if he didn't look at it and moved off to the side. The rifle changed him. The minute he picked it up, and he wasn't sure he liked the change very much, he set it aside, leaning it carefully against the wall. He could deal with that feeling later. The fire was out, and he used the butane lighter and a piece of birch bark with small twigs to get another one started, marveling at how easy it was. but feeling again that the lighter somehow removed him from where he was. What he had to know. With a ready flame, he didn't have to know how to make a spark's nest, or how to feed the new flames to make them grow. As with the rifle, he wasn't sure he liked the change. Up and down, he thought. The pack was wonderful, but it gave him up and down feelings. With the fire going and sending up black smoke and a steady roar from a pitch-smelling chunk he put on, he turned once more to the pack, rummaging through the food packets. He hadn't brought them out yet because he wanted to save them until last. Glory in them. He came up with a small electronic device completely encased in a plastic bag. At first, he thought it was a radio or a cassette player, and he had a surge of hope because he missed music, missed sounds, missed hearing another voice. But when he opened the plastic and took the thing out, he turned it over, he could see that it wasn't a receiver at all. There was a coil of wire held together on the side, and it sprung into a 3-foot-long antenna when he took the tape off. No speaker, no lights, just a small switch at the top and on the bottom, and he finally found in small print, emergency transmitter. That was it. He turned the switch back and forth a few times, but nothing happened. He couldn't even hear static. So, as with the rifle, he set it against the wall and went back to the bag. It was probably ruined in the crash, he thought. 2 bars of soap. He had bathed regularly in the lake, but not with soap, and he thought how wonderful it would be to wash his hair. Thick with grime and smoked dirt, frizzed by the wind and sun, matted with fish and full bird grease, his hair had grown and stuck and tangled and grown until it was a clumped mess on his head. He could use the scissors from the first aid kit to cut it off, then wash it with soap. And then, finally, the food. It was all freeze-dried and in such quantity that he thought, with this, I could live forever. Package after package he took out. Beef dinner with potatoes, cheese and noodle dinners, chicken dinners, egg and potato breakfasts, fruit mixes, drink mixes, dessert mixes, more dinners and breakfasts than he could count easily. Dozens and dozens, all of them in waterproof bags, all in perfect shape. And when he had them all out and laid against the walls in stacks, he couldn't stand it and went through them again. If I'm careful, he thought, they'll last as long as I need them to last. If I'm careful, no, not yet. I won't be careful just yet. First, I am going to have a feast. Right here and now, I'm going to cook up a feast and eat until I drop, and then I'll be careful. He went into the food packs once more and selected what he wanted for his feast. A 4-person beef and potato dinner with orange drink for an appetizer and something called peach whip for dessert. Just add water, it said on the packages, and cook for half an hour or until everything was normal sized and done. Brian went to the lake and got water in one of the aluminum pots and came back to the fire. Just that amazed him, to be able to carry water to the fire in a pot. Such a simple act that he hadn't been able to do for almost 2 months. He guessed at the amounts and put the beef dinner and peach dessert on to boil. Then he went back to the lake and brought water to mix with the orange drink. It was sweet and tangy, almost too sweet, but so good that he didn't drink it fast, but held it in his mouth and let the taste go over his tongue. Tickling on the sides, sloshing it back and forth, and then down, swallow, then another. That, he thought, that is just fine. Just fine. He got more lake water and mixed another one and drank it fast, then a third one, and he sat with it near the fire, but looking out across the lake, thinking how rich the smell was from the cooking beef dinner. There was garlic in it and some other spices, and the smells came up to him and made him think of home, his mother's cooking, the rich smells of the kitchen. And at that precise instant, with his mind full of home and the smell filling him, the plane appeared. Y'all, I just had chills. He had only a moment of warning. There was a tiny drone, but after it didn't register, then suddenly, roaring over his head, low in the back of the ridge, a bush plane, it with floats fairly exposed, exploded into his life. It passed directly over him, very low, tipped a wing sharply over the tail of the crashed plane in the lake, cut power, glided down to the long part of the L in the lake, then turned and glided back, touching the water gently once, twice, and settling with a spray to taxi and stop, with its floats gently bumping on the beach in front of Brian's shelter. He had not moved. It had all happened so fast that he hadn't moved. He sat with the pot of orange drink still in his hand, staring at the plane, not quite understanding it yet, not quite knowing yet that it was over. The pilot cut the engine, opened the door, and got out, balanced, and stepped forward on the float to hop onto the sand without even getting his feet wet. He was wearing sunglasses and took them off to stare at Brian. "I heard your emergency transmitter. Then I saw the plane when I came over." He trailed off, cocked his head, studying Brian. "Dang, you're him, aren't you? You're that kid. They quit looking a month. No, almost 2 months ago. You're him, aren't you? You're that kid." Brian was standing now, but still silent, still holding the drink. His tongue seemed to be stuck to the roof of his mouth, and his throat didn't work right. He looked at the pilot and the plane and down at himself, dirty and ragged, burned and lean and tough, and he coughed to clear his throat. "My name is Brian Robison," he said. Then he saw that his stew was done. The peach whip was almost done, and waved it with his hand. "Would you like something to eat?" Alrighty. So that is the end of this book. It's almost like he wrote it with anticipation of writing another one, because we don't get a whole bunch of joy there in the end. But it's really cool that he got found. He made his way through. So probably going to take the weekend off of reading, maybe. See what happens tomorrow morning. We'll go ahead and dive right into the next one. Hope everybody has a happy Friday.